uh, learn how to reason. Mike invited me to participate here today. Can you hear me all right, Mike?
Yes.
Because I've done a great deal of collaborative research on JFK, where I specialize in bringing together groups of experts to analyze and dissect complex and complicated cases, and have published extensively thereupon, including Sandy Hook, the Boston bombing, Orlando and Dallas, Charlottesville, Parkland, even the moon landing. My background is in the history and the philosophy of science, where I spent 35 years offering courses in logic, critical thinking, and scientific reasoning, and where it's indispensable in seeking to evaluate these events to apply the principles of scientific reasoning, including 4 stages: puzzlement, something doesn't fit into your background knowledge and experience. You therefore indulge in speculation. What are the possible alternative explanations of what has taken place? When you seek to arbitrate between them, it's essential to look at the available evidence to sort out the authentic from the inauthentic and to determine the probability of the available evidence on the alternative hypotheses, which gives you a measure of evidential support known as likelihoods. Now, it will turn out, as we discover here, that fabricated or altered evidence can be very telling, because there may be only a very limited number of parties who could have performed the fabrication or the alteration. When the evidence is settled down, we're entitled to accept the best supported hypothesis as true in the tentative and fallible fashion of science. Tentative insofar as with the addition of new evidence or available hypotheses, we may have to reject hypotheses we previously accepted, accept hypotheses we previously rejected, and leave others in suspense. Fallible, even the best supported hypothesis may turn out to be false. Newton's classical physics, for example, which posited absolute space and time, turned out to be a special limiting case when viewed from the perspective of Einstein's theory of relativity, and yet for approximately 200 years was viewed as an exemplar of the certainty of scientific knowledge, which is simply a mistake. All scientific knowledge is fallible. There's a very important methodological difference to appreciate between looking for confirming instances for a hypothesis and attempting to falsify them. Take, for example, the hypothesis all pennies are made of copper. You could deduce millions of examples of copper pennies as confirmations. But if you look seriously and seek to falsify the hypothesis, it turns out in 1943, because of the necessity, the need for copper for military purposes, pennies were made out of steel. The falsificationist hypothesis, therefore, is to test to determine whether they can be shown to be false, which was the case here. Now, when it comes to JFK, the government's official position is reflected by the Warren Commission report, which maintains that a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository at President Kennedy in the motorcade, that he hit JFK in the back of the neck, that it passed through his neck and entered the back of Governor John Connally, severely wounding but not killing him, and that Jack was then hit a second time in the back of the head, killing him. We find this report depicted many places. I note some of the locations here of particular importance: County Records Building, the Daltex Building, the Grassy Knoll, the Triple Underpass. We have to look at the evidential basis then on which this was supported. about the wounds sustained by the president, photographic and other proof that Lee Oswald was the lone assassin. The Zapruder and other home movies as visual confirmation where, if any of them turns out to be flawed, then the Warren report cannot be sustained. It turns out that all of them can be shown to be mistaken based upon fabricated evidence, even including the cover of Life magazine, which very conveniently tied together the alleged assassin with the weapon he's alleged to have used, a revolver with which he's supposed to have shot a Dallas police officer, and holding two communist newspapers, the Worker and the Militant, to imply that he was a communist sympathizer. All of this turns out to be fabricated or faked. Anyone who actually listened to the live news reporting the day of the assassination would know what the government has subsequently sought to cover up, that the president was hit in the throat by a bullet that was fired from in front, a small, clean, penetrating wound that was reported on television live that day, and that he'd been hit in the right temple with a bullet that passed through and blew out his brains, the back of his head. Those were reported that day. But the government has sought to cover up and only talk about shots fired from behind, where you'll see that, in fact, it turns out the bullet that's supposed to have hit him in the back of the neck actually hit him in the back, but about 5.5 inches below the collar and just to the right of the spinal column. It was correct, he was hit in the back of the head, but not from the book depository. Indeed, the shot to his back appears to have been fired from the county records building, to the back of the head from the Dow Tex, from the shot to the throat from inside the triple underpass, and the shot that hit the right temple from the intersection of the picket fence and the grassy knoll. Now here's the whole movie with which most of you may be familiar. It's only 27 seconds long. Notice there's a big jump right at the beginning. The motorcade is not shown turning from Houston onto Elm. That's serious. Meanwhile, notice how the vehicle seems to disappear, which is very strong. Properly panning, you would have followed the limousine. Here the president appears to be hit, frame 313. Jackie actually climbs back after a chunk of his skull and brains. We have discovered that the film was massively edited. Now, those who are aware, Oliver Stone did a magnificent film in 1991, which has been much debated, but which I can assure you represents the most accurate, complete, and comprehensive presentation of what actually happened in Dealey Plaza on 22 November 1963, ever presented to the American people through the mass media. Now, it was not flawless, as I shall explain, because he assumed the Zapruder film was accurate. He did not know Lee Oswald was not in the 6th floor window, and he assumed there were only 3 hit teams when there turned out to have been 8. Here you see one reconstruction by Gerald Posner of the shot that's supposed to have passed through his back. Notice Posner equivocates here. He actually puts it down into the jacket rather than right at the base of the neck, allegedly having gone through Jack's neck and hit Connolly in the back. Well, we have the jacket. You can see where the hole entered the jacket. We have the shirt. You can see where the bullet passed through the shirt. David W. Manick, who's a leading expert on the medical evidence in the world, went to the National Archives repeatedly, and on one occasion had a member of the staff put on the shirt and jacket and discovered that the hole in the shirt is slightly below the hole in the jacket. This is an autopsy diagram from Bethesda, and you can see here where I'm circling that there's a wound to the back identified. FBI agents noticed the wound to the back was lower than the wound to the throat when they participated as observers at the assassination. The president's personal physician, George Berkeley, noted that he died from a massive wound to the head, and a second wound occurred at the posterior back about the level of the third thoracic vertebrae. Well, that's down around here. You'll see even the Warren Commission staff in reconstructing initially thought Jack had been hit in the back and in the back of the head, represented by these two small marks. One of my favorite photographs from the archives is Arlen Specter showing with a pointer the trajectory of the magic bullet. Notice how he's showing it passing through the neck into Conley's back, but it's contradicted by the patch on the back where the bullet actually entered. Meanwhile, it turns out that Gerald Ford, who was then a member of the commission, had the description of the wound redescribed from his uppermost back, which was already an exaggeration, to the base of the back of the neck, which was false. David Mantic actually took a patient with similar chest and neck dimensions to JFK and plotted the official trajectory, which turns out not to be even anatomically possible because cervical vertebrae intervene. That's a really crucial finding. Anytime you discover a claim that violates the laws of physics, chemistry, biology, physiology, anatomy, aerodynamics, you know what you're being told is false. So if you actually locate the bullet where it actually entered, you see how preposterous is the magic bullet theory. This is well lampooned in Oliver Stone's film because it would have had to make a dramatic move to the left to exit the throat from where it entered in the back, which was, by the way, a shallow shot, only about as deep as a second knuckle on your little finger with no entry. And here's a photograph of the bullet recovered from a stretcher purported to have been the one that performed all these feats, for good reasons, therefore, described as the magic bullet. Meanwhile, with regard to the head wound, there were multiple witnesses at Dealey Plaza, at Parkland, and at Bethesda. Notice how consistently they report a blowout at the back of the head, witnesses from Dealey Plaza, witnesses from Parkland Hospital, even witnesses from Bethesda. We also have Clint Hill in talking about a book called The Kennedy Detail at a Warwick's bookstore in San Diego, explained how when he rushed up to the limousine, he pushed Jackie back down, lay across their bodies, and watched this huge gaping wound at the back of JFK's head. He was the first to observe it. His description is vivid. Remarkably enough, it even occurs in the book, which means that Clint Hill's own vivid, up-close and personal description contradicts the official finding. Even if Clint actually chucked Jackie, however, the films don't show him. I'll return to this. Here you can see the key sentence from the Kennedy Detail. Slumped across the seat, President Kennedy lay moving, a bloody, gaping, fist-sized hole clearly visible in the back of his head, implying a shot fired from behind. Indeed, when the active press secretary announced his death, he pointed to his right temple and, attributing the finding to Admiral Berkeley, said it was a simple matter of a bullet through the head entering the right temple. One of the physicians authorized this drawing of the wound. It was very substantial. Charles Crenshaw, MD, who was in trauma room number 1 when the president's moribund body was brought in, and 2 days later was responsible for the care and treatment of his alleged assassin, Lee Oswald, did these diagrams for me for my first collection on the assassination, entitled Assassination Science, where I brought together the best experts. You can see the hole in the back and from the side, a very significant defect. David Mantik went into the National Archives in late 1992 for the first time, telling me he thought he would find both that the autopsy x-rays had been altered and evidence of a second shot to the head. Here you see a distribution of metallic particles from that second shot to the head because it was done with a frangible or exploding bullet. Witnesses to the throat wound, also at Dealey Plaza at Parkland at Bethesda. This is Dr. Malcolm Perry, who performed a simple tracheostomy incision through the throat wound. It was a small, clean puncture wound, which Dr. Crenshaw also diagrammed for me. And then with the incision, a simple straight incision, very clean, where Dr. Perry would, during the Parkland press conference, 3 times describe this wound as a wound of entry, as a wound of entry. The wound would later be altered at Bethesda to make it look more like a wound of exit. This is indicative, of course, of falsification of evidence, in this case, even of the body itself. Also, notice the eyes here in this photograph are open, and yet Dr. Crenshaw, who is the last physician to observe the body when it was wrapped in sheets and placed into a brown ceremonial casket, closed JFK's eyes. Something's obviously wrong. Now, here's a very famous photograph, the most important of the assassination. If you look carefully, you can see a small spiral nebula with a dark hole in the center where JFK's left ear would be, as if his left ear were visible. He's already clutching his throat from the wound. Notice the Secret Service detail is looking around as though they have no idea what's going on. This area here will invite our attention because this particular figure has been thought to resemble Lee Harvey Oswald to a striking degree. Indeed, we have been able to confirm that it was Lee Harvey Oswald. Here you can see that puncture wound, that wound in the windshield. When the vehicle was parked at Parkland, many witnesses observed it. One officer actually stuck a pencil through it, and it had beveling or open area on the inside rather than the out, showing it was fired from the front inside the limousine. The Secret Service would subsequently present a completely different windshield with kind of a crack, claiming it had occurred from a fragment of a bullet fired from behind. Again, alteration of evidence. Who could have made that substitution? How could it have been done? Here we have evidence of the shot through the windshield in frame 225 of the Zapruder film. Here we have Thomas Evan Robinson, the mortician, who prepared the body for a funeral, found that in addition to a large gaping hole in the back of the head, there was a small wound in the temple and a wound on the back 5 to 6 inches below the shoulder, just to the right of the spinal column. Notice here, he also adds no swelling or discoloration to the face, which means he died instantly. In other words, JFK was dead in Dealey Plaza. Nevertheless, the House Select Committee, when it reinvestigated the case in 1977-78, reconstituted the back of the head. This was unbelievable for those who have actually studied the case. They moved the wound from low down, 4 inches higher to the top of the head in a diagram. But in the photographs, you cannot see the wound. This appears to have been an effort to redo the cover-up, the medical evidence, in a way that would be more successful. David Mantik, however, has shown that that can't possibly be accurate reconstruction because this significant chunk of skull was found in the grass the following day by a medical student by the name of Billy Harper. David has placed it in the back of the skull from which it emerged. Notice the HSCA has reconstituted the back of the head so it can't even accommodate. It's not even consistent with this massive chunk of skull. Meanwhile, In addition, further confirmation, physician after physician at Parkland reported cerebral as well as cerebellar tissue extruding from the blowout at the back of the head. Well, if there was no blowout at the back of the head, as the House Select Committee maintained, then there could not have been extruding cerebral and cerebellar tissue. Plus, I mean, this is just monstrous evidence of the extent of the cover-up. So that we actually have at Parkland, Bethesda, and the HSCA, 3 different versions of the back wound. At Parkland, a fist-sized wound. The witnesses report it, confirm it. This is the way the wound actually looked. At Parkland, you notice it's much enlarged. Remarkably, and this is very mostly suppressed, practically no one is aware of this, the pathologist in charge of the autopsy, James Humes, took a craniosalt to the skull of JFK and enlarged the wound so that it's virtually a whole back missing part of his head to try to resemble something that would look more like the effect of a shot from behind if Jack had been leaning way forward. Believe it or not, David Lifton was the first to expose this shenanigans. You can find it in the official autopsy report described in mathematical detail. You'd think this was a fantasy. And then you had the HSCA seeking to cover it up. So obviously we're already implicating members of the Secret Service and of the Navy Medical Corps at Bethesda in fabricating evidence. So, as I have indicated before, actually JFK appears to have been hit at least 4 times. Interestingly, David Manick now believes there was a second shot to the forehead that entered from the opposite side, from the left side, which would mean JFK was actually shot 5 times, once in the back from the county records building, once in the throat from inside the triple underpass, once in the back of the head from the Daltex, and then twice in the right and left temple, once from the north end of the triple underpass, the other from the opposite side. Now, the alleged assassin, Lee Oswald, as I indicated, appears to be in this area of the famous photograph taken by AP photographer James Ike Alchins. When you do a close-up, you can see why people have thought it might be. There are interesting figures here, such as this man known as Black Hole Man because his face is obliterated, his shirt is obliterated, another figure's face has been obliterated. Obviously, alteration has been done to the film. Now, the man in the doorway appears to have been Lee Oswald based upon the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, and the t-shirt he was wearing. Indeed, the Dallas Police Department appeared to have been so self-conscious that he had him remove his overshirt, this long-sleeve, richly textured shirt, very worn, in order to be photographed for his mugshot and his t-shirt to minimize the resemblance. Larry Rivera has done brilliant work finding a suitable image of Lee Oswald to create a GIF where you can see confirmation that the man in the doorway was indeed Lee Oswald. This is completely brilliant work. He also obtained a photograph of Billy Lovelady, who the government claims was a man in the doorway. You can see on the right, the features are not those of the man in the doorway. Billy's ears are too low, his jaw is too significant, his nose doesn't fit. This was some of the most brilliant work ever done on JFK by Larry Rivera. It turns out the man holding his hand up, however, actually was Billy Lovelady. So the government was trading on an equivocation. Billy Lovelady was in the doorway. He simply wasn't the figure known as Doorman, who turns out to have been Lee Oswald. So when you do a reconstruction of this area, it turns out Billy was wearing a short sleeve red and white vertically striped shirt that would have been very conspicuous, which is why the shirt had to be obfuscated. He was holding his hands up to protect his eyes from the sun. Meanwhile, in relation to the backyard photograph that were so incriminating, Larry has done similar brilliant work. Jim Mars and I have done a co-authored piece about the man in the backyard photographs, whom we concluded with Roscoe White. Among other reasons, Roscoe had this little bump around his wrist. The man who posed in the backyard had the little bump on his wrist. Lee Oswald, when shown one of these photographs, said that he knew something about photography, that it was someone else's body with his face imposed on the photograph. He was speaking completely properly. Larry found a photograph of Roscoe White in a swimsuit, and he was able to superimpose it on the body in the backyard photograph to confirm that indeed it was Roscoe White who stood in for Lee Oswald. Roscoe seems to have had a long history tied in with the CIA and may have committed as many as 50 assassinations of witnesses in the aftermath. Interestingly, even that photograph we talked about from the Bethesda autopsy report with the eyes open is not actually a photograph of JFK. There is a significant figure prominent in JFK research who has presented them as authentic, a man by the name of Robert Groden, who actually was enlisted by the HSCA as a special consultant to determine whether or not it was Lee Oswald in the doorway. And he came back with the false report that it was not Lee, which we've already seen is incorrect. Turns out that if you look at the profiles, it's pretty obvious these are not the same person. There's been considerable speculation about who might have been the subject for these. Look again. It's interesting that when they were contemplating having an open casket or not, Jackie and Bobby said it didn't even look like Jack, and they determined to have a closed casket. I believe the reason it didn't look like Jack is because it wasn't Jack. Here you have another GIF where you can see that the body in these autopsy photographs is not JFK, but some other person. Indeed, Dennis Davis, the NCA who is responsible for checking people in and out of the morgue during the autopsy, reported that they had a casket brought in. He was ordered not to log in. That appears to have been, he was told it was a major. I believe it was the major, the body in the casket. He was directed not to log in, who was the model for these photographs. Just to show how extensively the CIA has gone to conceal the fact, they've even created fake editions of newspapers to create the impression that the Alchin's photograph had appeared in public earlier than would have been possible to alter. But look, here's the original actual newspaper. Here's a substitute. Ralph Sinkay did brilliant work in order to locate this stunning evidence of the massive extent to which the government in this case has gone to conceal the truth from the American people. It turns out John P. Costello, who's another PhD in physics, like David Bantic, who's also an MD and board certified in radiation oncology, which is a study of cancer using X-ray therapy, because of which he's an expert in the interpretation of X-rays. John Costello is an expert in electromagnetism, the properties of light and images of moving objects, and he prepared a brilliant tutorial proving that although the home movies, in particular the Zapruder film, the most famous, which we've already observed once, was 98% technically perfect, the other 2% gave it away. One of the most obvious proofs is the sign was wrongly replaced. Comparisons of photos of the location and dimensions of the Stemmons Freeway sign reveal it was replaced by misplaced images. It demonstrates the sign was placed into the revised film without taking into consideration the optical distortion of the camera's lens. So you see here There are variations that occur. All these lines ought to be parallel, but they are not. Here you see one image of how it's misplaced. Here's another of how it's misplaced. Here is another. Here is another. And here is a GIF that John Costella created to show how they did not properly replace a Simmons sign, which had to be taken out, it appears, because it had a bullet hole that had passed through the sign, which was inconsistent with the official government account, claiming only three shots had been fired. It would not do to have another show up. Meanwhile, other signs that something's wrong with the film include the all but motionless spectators. Everywhere else in the motorcade, spectators are waving and cheering. During this portion of the motorcade, however, they're virtually motionless. The explanation appears to be the foreground was taken when the pilot car passed. Here you can see, waving, cheering, great enthusiasm throughout the crowd. No doubt about it. Everyone was wildly enthusiastic, but not in this instance. These spectators are all but motionless. Look, not one of them is waving, not one of them is cheering. How is that possible? Well, the film appears to have been reconstructed using optical printing and special effects, where optical printing enables you to combine any foreground with any background and make other alterations for the film. So they appear to have used footage taken earlier when the pilot car was passing by, and there was no reason to be excited in lieu of what would have been taking place had it been authentic, with all the waving, cheering. Look, nothing going on there. There you have the Simmons sign, and notice how the vehicle disappears. If Zapruder were actually following the vehicle, then it would not have disappeared but remained centered. This is evidence that this part of the footage was actually filmed on a tripod in the pergola area. Moreover, it's been massively edited, not only by removing the turn from Houston onto Elm, where the driver swerved out too widely, nearly hit a concrete abutment, had to pause to get back in line, which I believe was removed because it would have shaken the public's confidence in the Secret Service. But the driver actually pulled the limousine to the left and to a halt to make sure JFK would be killed. We have some 60 witnesses to the limo stop. Some saw it slow dramatically, others come to a complete stop. It slowed dramatically as it came to a complete stop. This was such an obvious indication of Secret Service complicity that it had to be removed. John Costella has done a brilliant compilation of dozens and dozens of reports about the limo stop. Among them is Tony Foster, who was interviewed by Deborah Conway in 2000. Tony told Deborah, for some reason, the car stopped. It stopped for seconds. I don't know why it stopped. And all of a sudden it sped up and they went under the underpass. I could never figure out why the car stopped. Turns out others made similar reports. Billy Lovelady himself was on the steps of the book depository. I recall that following the shooting, I ran toward the spot where President Kennedy's car had stopped. Roy Truly, who was Lee's supervisor in the book depository. The car I saw, the president's car, swerved to the left and stopped somewhere down in this area. Later, Mr. Bellin trying to dissuade him or weaken his testimony. When you saw the president's car seem to stop, how long did it appear to stop, Mr. Truly? It would be hard to say, over a second or two, something like that. I just saw it stop. I don't know. I didn't see it start up. Meanwhile, Mrs. Earl Campbell, the mayor's wife, who is a formidable woman, I was aware that the motorcar had stopped dead still. There was no question about that. She repeated, as I told you, the motorcade was stopped when Mr. Hubert tried to weaken her testimony. That was when your car at least had come to a standstill? Mrs. Campbell. Every car in the motorcade had come to a standstill. We were dead still for a matter of some seconds. Now there are witnesses to the other film. In other words, what appears to have been the original before it was massively edited to take out the limo stop, the turn from Houston on to Elm, and other effects to obscure the sequence of shots. Erwin Schwartz observed brain matter blown out to the left rear. This was an associate of Abraham Zapruder who viewed the film in what appears to have been its original state at Eastman Kodak. He said he'd seen Kennedy's head suddenly whip around to the left, seen an explosion of blood and brains from the head blown out to the left rear. Noel Twyman, investigating, interviewing him for his magnificent work, Bloody Treason, pressed him on this crucial point, but Schwartz was emphatic. You can find his account in Noel's book. Here are other important observations. The other film included the turn from Houston on to Elm, and this is from 4 witnesses who have actually seen what appears to be the other film. This is a distillation. It shows Greer bringing the limousine to an abrupt halt. During the limousine, JFK is hit twice in the head, once from behind and slumps forward, once from the front, and he slumps to the rear. What happens is he slumps forward from that shot fired from the Daltex. Jackie eases him back up. She's looking him right in the face when he's hit in the right temple. She goes out to climb after the chunk of skull as he slumps to the rear. But it's gradual. It's not the violent left into the rear following. Greer, the driver, watches the whole time, then hits the accelerator. Here's another Secret Service agent who's confirming the chunk of the flattered blood and brains all over the trunk, which you do not see in the Zapruder film because, of course, they had to clean it up. Another member of the detail had become nauseated from observing the blood and gore on the limousine truck. The motorcycle escort officers are a fascinating aspect of this because, as I observed during the limo stop, he was hit at least twice in the head. David now believes a third time. Officer Baker dismounted his bike and ran between the cars to the grassy knoll, which would have been impossible had the cars been moving. Officer Jackson, on the right, rode his bike up the grassy knoll. 5 Secret Service agents surrounded the presidential limousine. Larry is an absolutely sensational work. Here you have Officer Baker actually slowing. He would park his bike. You might even ask how Clint Hill could have rushed up and got on the limousine if it had been traveling, say, 11 miles an hour even, which was far below the 30 miles an hour that was the minimal speed. Since the idea of him being able to run so fast is would have been some kind of record here. Meanwhile, as I said, here's a diagrammatic indication of what Larry Revere discovered from hearing the testimony of these 4 crucial witnesses that were recorded by a first-generation student, but where Larry transcribed them, and very painfully, painstakingly, of Jackson motoring up on the grassy knoll, Hargis parking his bike, rushing between the limousines, the 5 swarming the JFK limo. Here you can see creases in the grass from the motorcycle. This is from one of the other films, in this case, the Bell film. In fact, there was even one newspaper report that had it. This is Officer Hargis actually returning to his bike from having rushed up to the grassy knoll. Here's Hargis again, where his bike is parked. This is Peverly Oliver. This is Mary Moorman and Gene Hill, who are taking photographs of the president. One of Mary's photographs being quite famous, known as the Mormon. You can find Larry's work online, the JFK Horseman Part 1 of 2, and the JFK Horseman Part 2 of 2, which is slightly improved over the original. There were external inconsistencies too. Here you see the closest that Clint Hill gets to Jackie in the Zapruder film. But look at this in the next film taken from the opposite side. He actually comes in contact with her. That means something is wrong. They appear to have edited the Zapruder film and then used it as a guideline to edit the other films, of which the most important is the Knicks, but they were only partially successful. So here you see the considerable distance, the closest in the Zapruder, how much closer in the Nix. Meanwhile, why they had to be fixed. JFK was hit at least 4 times, in the back from behind, in the throat from in front, at least twice in the head, once from behind and once from the right rear. Now, of course, David believes, in addition, again from the left rear, there were at least 6 shooters who fired 8 to 10 shots, possibly more. We now know actually there were 2 additional shooters for a total of 8. Meanwhile, it's often claimed that nobody ever talked about the assassination, and therefore there could not have been a conspiracy, but lots of people talked. Noel Twyman, in his book Bloody Treason, for example, observed that Carlos Marcello, one of the big mafia kingpins, bragged about it. Santo Trafficante explained that Kennedy would be killed. Joseph Miltier, a right-winger, bragged Kennedy would be killed, how it would be done. Johnny Rosselli, Sam Giancana's right-hand man, told Jack Anderson Ruby was their man in order to silence Oswald. David Atlee Phillips, head of CIA for the Western Hemisphere, suspected of being the mysterious Maurice Bishop, said before he died that fringe elements of U.S. intel may have been involved. Well, he was among them. As earlier noted, Lyndon Johnson's mistress, Madeline Brown, said Lyndon implied before he was killed it was going to happen. Marita Lawrence, CIA contract agent, actually a mistress of Fidel Castro, explained in deposition that Frank Sturgis, who fired the shot that entered the right temple, told her he and a group of anti-Castro Cubans had been involved. Sam Giancana's brother, Chuck, revealed in the book Double Cross that Sam had confessed to being involved in the crime. Also others, Chauncey Marvin Holt, one of the 3 tramps escorted through Dealey Plaza, whom I got to know personally. Charles Harrelson, the father of Woody. Jim Hicks, communication guy. Jack Ruby, Billy Saul Estes. Plenty of people have talked. Now, when you look at the alternative theories, you have to realize the profundity of discovering the evidence was altered. Think of it this way. The KGB could not have extended into Bethesda Naval Hospital to alter x-rays under control of the U.S. Navy and the American Secret Service. The Fidel Castro, anti-Castro Cubans couldn't have substituted someone else's brain for the brain of JFK, where the brain in the National Archives is a virtually intact brain when JFK had half his brains blown out in Dealey Plaza. Note too, the mob could not have got a hold of the Zapruder film to alter it. That means there's only a very small number of individuals and groups, including the CIA, the Secret Service, and the medical officers who had to have been involved in the cover-up. So Noel Twyman, in his brilliant book, explained that the most perfect combination with the greatest probability of success was to combine the CIA and military with the Secret Service, the Mafia, Lyndon Johnson, and Hoover, where Lyndon would be responsible after for what would happen and could cover it up by, for example, appointing a commission that would cut off any further investigations. All Lyndon had to do was recruit the CIA, who had used the Mafia as needed, and the Secret Service, and he had a perfect conspiracy. The actual shooting scenario looked a great deal like this. So, why did the Warren Commission not get it straight? Notice here, they even have this fake photograph where this real photograph of where the bullet actually entered, but it didn't pass through Jack's body. There was no point of entry. So even the New York Times, alas, sad to say, was complicit in the cover-up. Lyndon Johnson appears to have been the mastermind. In 1960 in Los Angeles during the Democratic Convention, when Jack had already invited Stuart Symington from Missouri to be his running mate, but gave him overnight to think about it. Meanwhile, Bobby went by the Johnson suite with a pro forma invitation for Lyndon to run and was dumbfounded when Johnson jumped on it. He would subsequently threaten to expose that Jack suffered from Addison's disease, which meant he wouldn't live a long, healthy life. that among his mistresses and dalliances was a beautiful woman spy for East Germany. And he told Bobby if he were not on the ticket, then any legislative proposals from the White House would be dead on arrival, because as the powerful majority leader of the Senate, he would bottle them up. Jack and Bobby could figure no way around it. They had to accede to his demands. When one of Lyndon's powerful supporters, Rich, learned about this, he burst into the Johnson suite cursing and swearing, because now LBJ would help JFK become elected. Bobby Baker took him into a bedroom and explained what they had in mind. He came out all smiles and said he thought that was an excellent plan. Bobby Baker would later declare in public that JFK would not live out his first term and that he would die a violent death. Lyndon would, in the course of events, send his chief administrator